its Central Command described yesterday as the toughest day of resistance so far. And if that needed reinforcing, it has been this morning with images of a downed or abandoned Apache helicopter. So with me now is the RAF and British military spokesman here, Group Captain Al Lockwood, to discuss some of the issues arising. We've heard reports from our correspondents of resistance right across southern Iraq. The perception is that this is all proving a lot tougher than was anticipated.
Not quite so, Kevin. We did anticipate there would be some resistance, but the nature of resistance has proven somewhat different than first envisaged. Instead of regular army, Iraqi army, that is, troops resisting, most of those are tending to surrender to our forces. We find that we're meeting irregular troops, those of the Fayadeen and the SSO, the security organization. Those who are actually very close to the regime of Saddam Hussein. These are the people who have nothing to lose. They will take no part in the future of Iraq. Therefore, some of them are choosing to stand and fight.
But there seems to be a tactic of perhaps the Iraqis allowing heavy armor to go through and then attacking from behind or from the flanks the more vulnerable elements, the supply convoys and so forth. Does this herald a kind of guerrilla campaign?
You could call it that, but I refer you to what I said before. We have to remain on our guard. Any plan only survives first contact with the enemy. We're now beginning to see a style of attack against our coalition that we now need to counter. We will take our time, we'll use our tactics, we'll use our weaponry to counter them.
And the land the Royal Marines have taken could be a scene from World War I. Mud, barbed wire, bomb craters, and trenches. It's the first thing they and we do, dig in. The Marines have now taken a vast swathe of southern Iraq, securing its oil field. These masks are fairly new and they'd protect the troops against nerve agent, poisons that explode in the air. Iraq had huge stocks of this. These masks don't prove Saddam has chemical weapons, but Britain and the US don't use them. So why would Saddam issue these to his troops?
Back there apparently that wants to keep going.
Word has just gone down the line here to keep your heads down. Shots are coming out of the building still. But obviously the US Marines are not satisfied that that building is safe, so they are still pounding it, and I suspect they will take it down brick by brick if necessary.
In relation to where John is, but it is quite a sight to see so much equipment moving so quickly heading north. Elizabeth?
Okay, so just to make sure our conflicting information is cleared up, Mike, you are moving, progress is going, you have not been stopped.
We have been stopped, Elizabeth, periodically, and a lot of it is through our own maintenance. They're doing maintenance on vehicles, or a vehicle will break down or whatever, but we do not seem to be stopped because of any fighting or anything of that nature. That's not to say as we go further we may encounter some of this, but at this point now we have been having fairly clear sailing for the last 2 hours. Elizabeth?
You see the American captives on Iraqi television, those who tried to invade Souk Shuyukh, and you will see their burnt armor and vehicles.
Carried out by combat engineers, men of 26 Squadron, 26 Armoured Engineer Squadron, Royal Engineers. They had come across a series of ammunition dumps here in a village just south of Basra in southern Iraq. It seemed as if Iraqi soldiers who were in tanks had tried to destroy those tanks by stuffing them full of RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortar bombs. Those had failed to detonate and they had abandoned the scene. In the meantime, civilians from the local population were coming and helping themselves to some of this ammunition. A very dangerous situation indeed, as soldiers, other parts of the squadron, were trying to deal with small arms fire coming from the village, from perhaps some of the civilians who'd helped themselves to this to this ammunition. They've thrown off a cordon around it. They then lay detonators and charges onto that live ammunition. They also use their digging equipment to build sand embankments around the main areas of detonation, that to prevent the RPGs in particular from firing out. They can fire some distance and could cause a great deal of damage. The ammunition and the tanks were anyway situated in craters, but they were fairly shallow craters, so they were determined to try and protect the surrounding houses from any possible damage. They then detonated that, a series of explosions, thick black smoke, having first of all, of course, closed off the roads in the neighbouring area, around a kilometre square around it, just as a safety precaution.
Well, Jim, in terms of another strategic target, those were the Rumaila oil fields in southern Iraq, and we visited those today. Basically, what we found was that there are still a very few oil wells on fire, but those are very, very few, about 7 out of a total of 500 in that oil field. And we saw that the object of this, right from the very beginning of the ground invasion, was to seal and take these oil fields and keep them intact. And this is what we found there today. At war, would the Iraqi regime resort to a scorched earth policy? Would it torch its own oil fields, as US and British officials insisted? That was the big question. And to be sure, close up, any oil well fire looks catastrophic. But in fact, only 7 of about 500 wells in the Rumaila oil field, Iraq's biggest, have been set ablaze.
In the end, there was effectively nothing at all, which was, for us, very reassuring, but we actually obviously had to work on worst case.
So just hours after the ground invasion began, US Marines raced to secure these fields in southern Iraq, followed closely by British Royal Engineers and explosive experts.
This wasn't a little sideshow in the operation. This was a critical part of the coalition operation. Whatever the future form that Iraq takes, I mean, pervasive in that is its oil and its oil income.
Indeed, this field in the south produces 60% of Iraq's oil, and everyone remembers the ecological and environmental havoc Iraq caused by setting Kuwait's oil fields ablaze 12 years ago. In a futile attempt to obscure the vision of invading US and British forces, the Iraqis did fill some trenches with oil around key installations. Some of those trenches they set on fire. And now there is a fairly strong smell of oil in the air. But according to the British Royal Engineers here, there is no evidence yet of any attempts by the Iraqis to booby-trap or cause serious sabotage. Army engineers discovered that by picking carefully through the critical gas and oil separation plants, shutting down valves and the big taps called manifolds. They are all off now, awaiting private contractors to restart the oil production. The Iraqi army put up some resistance and US Marines took some combat casualties. But here, as elsewhere in Iraq, many soldiers surrendered. The British say they have 500 POWs, and that number could grow to 1,000. And as they begin to secure large parts of the south, more troops and materiel pour in, pushing ever deeper up country.
Americans killed, and their losses in the American side in more than one axis, because the Americans came from many axes, so we, of course, caused them losses and casualties. Captives, we have captives in other units under the control of the army as a whole. But in my area of responsibility, there are no captives, but in other divisions there are.
Fast.
What happened? Is it a pilot?
These Ba'ath Party militiamen said they saw one downed pilot who'd parachuted into the Tigris River. The mood became frantic. Within minutes, speedboats had been launched to search the river. They peered into the holes in the foundations of the bridge to see if anyone was hiding there. More security officials began arriving. Then, rumors of another sighting. The whole atmosphere was panicked and confused. Perhaps the imagined pilot was hiding in the reeds. Just imagine you'd been shot down over a city where you'd bombed targets, and all this was going around you. Up until now, there's been no confirmation that any British or American pilot has been found. By early evening, the city was still engulfed in smoke and ash.
Although airstrikes have continued throughout today, the thick and acrid black smoke that has enveloped Baghdad is not the result of missiles and bombs. They're from fires started by the authorities in the hope that this smoke will make targets invisible to British and American warplanes.
Tornado is a strike attack aircraft equipped with precision-guided bombs and missiles. It is in action in these skies every day. The downed plane had completed its mission in Iraq and was returning to what should have been the safety of Kuwaiti skies when it was struck by a Patriot missile.
We're in a war zone. Everyone is working really hard, hopefully to their limit, to ensure we get best out of them. Things go wrong in a war zone. In the aircraft, 2,000 sorties in one day. Accidents can happen, and unfortunately today one did.
Coalition aircraft and Patriot batteries are fitted with computer systems that are supposed to talk to each other. A simple 4-digit code identifies the aircraft as friendly. Then the Tornado should have been flying in a so-called safety corridor, which the missile battery should have recognized. Finally, the aircraft should transmit a radar signature identifying it as a plane and not a missile. This morning, that system broke down.
This is a worst-case scenario for a pilot and certainly for the crew of the missile battery too, to have a friendly fire situation which has led to the bringing down of your own side assets is just the worst situation to be in.
These are dangerously crowded skies. The question now raised is this: is there a flaw in the way US and UK systems communicate with each other?
If the biggest risk to coalition troops on the ground is resistance from the Iraqi army, in the air the greatest danger is from aircraft accident or, as in the last Gulf War, from so-called friendly fire. Fog of war or not, air commanders here say they'll be working hard now to put in place a system that diminishes the risk of this happening again. Alan Little, BBC News, Kuwait.
A veteran of numerous conflicts, this was to be one of Terry Lloyd's final reports for ITV News. He was travelling independently of Allied forces with his camera team. He would have been acutely aware of the dangers as they drove in the direction of Basra. There had been heavy fighting in the area. They then saw Iraqi soldiers and decided to turn back. At this moment, their vehicle came under heavy fire. An investigation is trying to establish if they were killed by coalition forces. One team member managed to escape with his life.
Members of Alpha Company secure their hold of the area around vital oil installations in southern Iraq. At roadblocks, every mode of transport is checked. There are reports Saddam Hussein loyalists have been offering money to local people for weapons to fight the coalition army. Then a stroke of luck. One man who's been stopped offers up information about the position of enemy forces in the nearby town of Al-Faw. A few hours later, we're on the move. We've been told a hardcore element of Saddam Hussein supporters based in the local Ba'ath Party headquarters could cause problems. Soon enough, gunshots ring out and we take cover. It takes a while to pinpoint exactly where the shots are coming from. We are slowly being sucked into a street fight.
It seems the gunfire has been coming from the police station down here, and there are reports of gunmen positioned on some of the rooftops. This is the kind of urban warfare no Marine wants to fight.
The gunmen have been firing at us all day, so US Marines call in air support.
I don't want them to overfly the town unnecessarily. Within
a few minutes, A-10 tank busters fly just 200 feet above us, trying to scare the enemy into surrender. On a rooftop overlooking the Ba'ath Party headquarters, Alpha Company have come up with a plan to storm the building.
What we're going to do is basically mallet it and put as much firepower into it as can.
Alpha Company commandos attack, blowing up the entrance, shooting those inside. A Marine is in trouble. Colleagues douse the flames. 2 others have been burned, only 1 seriously. As the 3 Marines who were injured are treated, the day's events demonstrate the difficulties faced by an invading army of subduing resistance in built-up areas. Clive Myrie, BBC News in southern Iraq.
Near the city of Najaf, some 100 miles south of Baghdad. American tanks and armoured vehicles continued the move north, supported by Apache helicopter gunships. A U.S. Army spokesman said prisoners had been taken and that there had been no American casualties.
The 7th Cavalry's progress forward northward appears to have stalled. The cavalry was poised to make a giant push through a city in south-central Iraq. And at mid-afternoon, this unit began taking some very serious artillery fire, which caused the troop concentrations or the armored vehicle concentrations to disperse. And there was sporadic artillery fire from Iraqi units after that. One can only conclude at this point that the decision to go forward has been thwarted or delayed while the Air Force has been called in to pound the suspected artillery positions in front of the 7th Cavalry. But right now, the 7th Cavalry is stalled along the way. It is not moving forward, and moving forward was the original plan. Jim?
Walter, going back to that earlier incident in which the forward observers, that would be people on the ground with binoculars, you had reported earlier, and I want you to repeat it if you can. Tell us the circumstances, what they saw regarding what appeared to be civilians.
Jim, I'll be as precise as I can be. I was standing at the command post, the forward command post of the 3rd Squadron, 7th Cavalry, and an officer told me, get your camera ready. We're calling in a close air support attack. That means the Army was calling in the Air Force to dislodge an Iraqi emplacement ahead of us. It was the remnants of a battalion which is putting up quite stiff resistance. We were waiting for the attack, the airstrike to come in, and then we were told suddenly it was canceled. When I began inquiring as to why the airstrike was canceled, the commanding officer of this brigade told me that his forward combat observers had seen the Iraqis moving women and children into this particular emplacement, this particular area, which was the target for an airstrike. That's why the airstrike was canceled, but there was no question in the commander's mind that that was what he was seeing. Indeed, it was his impression that the Fedayeen, an elite unit of Saddam's military, has now taken over command of the battlefield in front of us because we were given to believe, or the impression was, that the regular Iraqi army units out there in front of us wanted to surrender, but the Fedayeen, which is an extraordinarily elite crack organization in front of us, wouldn't do that, and they are apparently the ones who ordered the human shields to be taken, using Iraqi civilians to thwart the American Army's forward progress. Jim?
The somber tones of a service held today on board Ark Royal to remember 7 comrades who were killed when 2 Sea King helicopters from the ship collided yesterday. 1 seat left empty, save for the squadron colours and the instrument of a dead crewman. Later, the Sea Kings of 849 Squadron were flying again. But Saturday's accident is only one of a series that have killed 16 British servicemen in a war where so far none have perished from enemy fire. Today, the latest incident and the most disturbing, when a Tornado GR4 with a crew of 2 returning from a mission over Iraq was shot down by friendly fire.
As professional military people, we accept that sadly these things do occasionally occur. We have a task, we have a military mission that we have been asked to do. We will continue, and we'll continue until we successfully conclude.
The military is reporting rapid progress by their forces towards Baghdad, including the capture of important bridges over the Euphrates at the town of Nasiriyah. But in the confusion there, it appears a convoy of maintenance vehicles took a wrong turn, and a number of American troops were surrounded and captured by Iraqi forces. Iraq's decision to put them on television is a breach of rules governing war and has already been condemned by the International Red Cross.
Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld.
The pictures were briefly broadcast by the CBS network and brought this reaction from the US Defense Secretary.
I will say this, the Geneva Convention indicates that it's not permitted to photograph and embarrass or humiliate prisoners of war. And if they do happen to be American or coalition ground forces that have been captured, the Geneva Convention indicates how they should be treated. Responding to Iraqi propaganda, it seems to me, is not what the United States Armed Forces are about.
Thanks, John. You're right. All day we've seen and heard the battle raging in Qasr, a port town on the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border where I'm standing now, and still the fighting goes on. Tonight, these are the pictures we've taken from our vantage point as American Marines try to dislodge the Iraqi troops holding out in the town. And across Iraq, British troops are continuing to advance towards Baghdad, though they're still encountering pockets of resistance. But a military source today said that they wouldn't allow the march to the Iraqi capital to be slowed down by the defenders, and vowed that the coalition forces would reach Baghdad by Tuesday. So this is where we stand on day 4 of the war. Coalition troops are now just 100 miles away from Baghdad, but they've met strong resistance at the city of Najaf. And there's been resistance too at the town of Nasiriyah. Royal Marines now control the outskirts of Basra, but not the city itself. And as I was saying, in Qasr, warplanes and tanks have been trying to overcome Saddam's elite Republican Guard. From there, just a couple of miles from here, David Bowden filed this report.
It began at breakfast time as a small skirmish. By lunchtime, we had witnessed a full-scale battle.
Tarpon, this is Tarpon 1 Bravo, over.
US Marines spotted suspicious movement in a building close to their position in the port of Qasr, and events quickly escalated. Just after 8 o'clock in the morning here in the port at Qasr, and a huge firefight has begun between the American Marines here and presumably Iraqi fighters on the other side of this berm. We don't know what started it, but it's been going on for a couple of minutes now. Heavy machine gun fire traced across the dusty landscape, suppressing the Iraqi gunmen. But it soon became apparent heavier weaponry would be needed to completely eradicate the problem. Mortar rounds went in, and then 2 Javelin missiles wobbled into the air before streaking towards their target. The first was too long, but the second went straight in the front door. There was no more firing from the building. Tanks then moved in, edging along the road in front of the target building. But more enemy positions were spotted. All came under sustained tank fire. The hours ticked by and the tanks continued to fire sporadically. Iraqi civilians were seen crossing the battlefield, at least one carrying a white flag. Then another racking up of the US onslaught. Airstrikes were called in. First an American F-18, then a British Harrier delivered massive bombs onto the battlefield. More than 4 hours after it had begun, the battle was over. But the US forces here had been delayed by another half a day in their mission. Iraqi troops proving again that they can still frustrate the coalition invaders. David Bowden in Qasr.
Taken. Many more have died under withering fire from the Marines. Right across southern Iraq, British and American forces are forging their way north. But in some built-up areas, they're meeting resistance. The street fighting in the south may be a taste of things to come if American and perhaps British troops have to fight their way into bigger urban centres like Basra and ultimately Baghdad. This morning, a helicopter arrived to take documents seized from the Iraqi army in the south back to headquarters, where they'll be analysed for any evidence that Iraq possesses chemical or biological weapons. Also on the helicopter, a Royal Marine from 4-2 Commando whose brother was killed in a helicopter crash on the night of the invasion, a crash which took the lives of 7 other British servicemen. This Marine has fought on for 3 days, knowing his brother's fate. This flight will take him back to Britain. Bill Neely, ITV News with the Royal Marines in southern Iraq.